DB, shaping your new normal.
Welcome everyone, wherever you are around the world, to the 2022 APEC OCI Days by Apaco UC. This is our first year having a dedicated OCI event, and it's our honor and privilege to run this event with the support of 15 Oracle user groups and Java user groups in the Asia Pacific region. Please remember to register to as many sessions as you can. This way you will be able to have access to our replays until June 15. I would like to say thanks to our Oracle user groups and Java user groups that made this event possible, and also to our sponsors, the Oracle ACE community, the DevRel team, and our main sponsors, Oracle Corporation and CloudDB. Now for today's session, the latest and greatest Python database API for Oracle Database by Christopher Jones and Sharad Chandran. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask questions to Christopher and Sharad by using the chat window on the right lower corner of the screen. And Christopher and Sharad will be answering all your questions at the end of the session. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to let me know using the same chat window, and I will try to help you the best I can. Also, if you are one of the user groups watching through Facebook stream, Facebook Live, that we're streaming also for 4 different user groups, please if you have any questions, please let your moderator know by the chat on the streaming, and the moderator will let me know at the end of the presentation if you have any questions coming from these 4 user groups via Facebook. Now, without more further ado, I'm going to leave you with this amazing session by Christopher Jones. Christopher, I know that looks like this will be your first presentation about this topic globally with the release of the new API.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Francisco. And by the way, congratulations on starting a new role at Oracle. Really looking forward to working even more closely with you. I know you're a superhuman when it comes to organizing conferences and sessions like this, and that's just great that we've got that closer tie now. So today we are talking about the latest and greatest Python database API for Oracle Database. Let me just actually stop the video. I think it gives you a little bit more screen width, and the video of me gives you a little bit of screen width issues. You all know what I look like. So without further ado, let's go on. So this is the traditional stack that we show our users about the work that we do in my wider group. So we look after all of the database access APIs for all of the languages that you can see here. I'm a product manager in this group. I've worked closely with open source groups in the past, notably PHP, and more recently with the Python and Node.js drivers for Oracle Database. So I kind of look after the yellow and the red bits of the stack there, the open source areas. We own some of these drivers and contribute directly to them. We contribute to the third-party Godrow driver. Tamash does a great job with that. And then some of our other community maintainers out there also have language drivers out there. So as you can see on this slide, most of these are what we call thick client drivers. We're obviously going to be talking about Python Oracle Database today. It's a thick client. It sits on top of actually a free open source wrapper around our Oracle Call C interface C library. So you need to install that C library separately, thick drivers. Only JDBC and managed.NET drivers are thin, and they talk directly through to the database. But today we are introducing Python Oracle DB, which is the new name for CX Oracle. And the key thing here is it's a new major release, name change, sure, has got a lot of great new functionality. And the key thing that we want to talk about is that it's now a thin driver by default with an optional thick mode. I don't know how Francisco managed to line up this conference session with the release dates, but somehow it's all lined up and you're the first to hear about this. So we now have on our stack on the right, we've got this new pillar, Python Oracle DB. You can see it goes right through to the database on the right, or it actually still uses ODBC ODP-IC and Oracle Call Interface to talk to the database if necessary, and I'll go through some of this duality of modes through this session. So this session really is going to be talking about the new features, mostly this thin and thick modes, and then I'm going to just show you some code, and we'll just dig into what it looks like and how you can use it, just so we don't get bored with slideware. So one driver, two modes. It's thin driver by default. So out of the box, you can connect directly to Oracle Database. You can optionally install Oracle Client libraries for additional functionality, and that functionality matches the CX Oracle driver that you have at the moment. Remember, it's just a renamed version of that driver. And really what we've done is actually add a thin mode to CX Oracle. I know all of you would love all of the functionality that CX Oracle has to be available in the new thin mode. That's just an ongoing effort for us. This is a V1 release of that thin mode, and we'll be adding more and more as we go forward. So you can see the stack there. Python process is obviously Python. We have our module, the driver interface, just installed pretty quickly. You can talk directly to Oracle Database if you want. Oracle Client libraries are optional. Still a kind of mid-tier solution that we're talking about here, Python language. So this is a little sidebar slide. It's nothing really to do with the presentation, but it is an announcement. This is actually our first open source thin driver. So a significant milestone for Oracle because our other thin drivers are binary releases. So now you can, for the first time, look at our source code of how communication to the database is handled directly. This driver, this first release of Python Oracle DB, focuses on support for the Python DB API. And we've added extra connectivity in there so we can support pooling and database resin connection pooling and connections to autonomous databases and things like that. And as we go forward, as I mentioned, we'll be adding more and more functionality into this thin driver. So the need to know stuff. What do you need to walk away with from this presentation? Knowing, renamed, we've mentioned that. It's still a binary module. So the code now has a Python layer at the top, and beneath that, the driver is now written in Python, and that gets compiled into binary object for performance. Works with Python 3 only. So 3.6, and you probably do know that Python 3.6 is no longer supported upstream. Still supported on Linux, so we actually have packages there which will work for 3.6 on Linux. Windows, the first package is 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, etc. Apple by default comes with Apple supplies Python 3 by default, sorry, 3.8 by default. So we have Python 3.8, 3.9, 3.10 on Apple. Gets a little confusing, but basically, as the community moves on, 3.6 gets deprecated. Some things aren't available. We'll just ship binary packages that you can install directly where possible. One key thing here is this is the first time we've had binary packages for Apple, and they're also universal 2 binaries, which is great because you can use them on the M1 chip. We've actually been testing on M1. I've tried a little bit with Alpine. That works fine. Haven't tried FreeBSD or some Internet of Things devices, but I'm sure if they have Python, you can get those to talk to Oracle Database directly. None of these are part of our regular testing process, but we'll certainly try and make sure things work smoothly where we can. Both modes do support that DB API, so you can use them with things like SQL Alchemy and Django. In our documentation, there's 3 or 4 lines of code you can add to those files so you can start testing immediately. 1 or 2 other changes might need to be made by those driver maintainers for full functionality, particularly around some dead connection detection, because our error messages have changed because we don't have the Oracle C stack anymore to return some error messages. So where those frameworks are trying to pick up error codes, they might need to add a little bit of code in there to make things really solid. But you can certainly use them. We've been running the test suites for Django and SQL Alchemy. Great shout out to those teams for very big test suites. Picked up a lot of issues in our early days with various syntaxes. So yeah, we can certainly use those immediately out of the box with thin mode or the thick mode of the driver. License has changed a little bit. It's still open source. It used to be the BSD, gone to sort of more standard Apache 2 and UPL, which is a sort of Oracle's general direction for these open source licenses. So it's major release. You've all handled major releases before. It's the same. You do your due diligence, you check what works, you do some testing, you decide whether it works for you, whether or not your projects are static and you don't want to upgrade, or you just want to use it for new releases. That's totally up to you. You can still install and run CX Oracle and the new driver at the same time because they have completely different namespaces. So it has some new features, obviously, thin mode we talked about, minor changes. So there might be some little bits of backward compatibility breaks you want to look at. Befitting a major release where we've made some tweaks. The pool get mode, which when you say get a connection from a connection pool, used to perhaps return an error if the pool was growing and there wasn't a connection available for immediate use. Now, just to make things a little nicer, we'll kind of wait for a connection to become available in that scenario when the pool grows and has created some connections. You can obviously change those flags backwards if you want the old behavior. Because it's a kind of new code base, some of the older deprecated features, the advanced queuing API, that was deprecated in 7.2 of CX Oracle, so we didn't implement that. But many of those previously deprecated, things marked deprecated still work, so most of the upgrade should be straightforward for you. We've taken advantage of the major upgrade to do some modernizations, particularly around namespace. You may know session pool is a very sort of C Oracle client's library name for session pool. Since we don't have a C client library, we've taken the opportunity to rename this whole thing create pool. You can still use session pool in your code if you want, but as you modernize and go forward, start using create pool. And similarly, things like these S pool attr vals, very C-like. If you look in the Oracle C header files, now we've kind of got a better namespace for some of these things. So you can do some modernization as you go on upgrade as well. So installing is pretty easy. One quick install command, pip install Oracle DB. The driver itself, about 4.2 megabytes, depends on a couple of other packages, Python packages, cryptography, and itself pulls in CFFI, the foreign function interface, and PyC parser. They take about 11 meg on my Mac, so it's about 15 meg. You can strip binaries, etc., as you like. Obviously, if you're going to install in thick mode, you need to install instant client. The basic light package is unstripped with everything just straight unzipped is about 123 megabytes for me. If you just use basic, which is a slightly bigger package, it's about double that size. So effectively, we're tenth of the size of the old driver, just at giving you runtime functionality. So thick versus thin, what are the differences? What is there to look at? So reading from the top, 11.2 database, as you know, goes out of its extended final market-driven support at the end of this year. There's some protocol differences, so we didn't spend any effort on that to get this release out of the door. We had enough testing with 12, 18, 19, 21, and the future stuff to get on with. So the thin driver connects to Oracle Database 12.1 or later. I mean, we know some of you would love to have 11.2 support because you're still using it. Sorry about that. We just need to keep moving forward and looking forward, spending effort where it's worthwhile for us. Thick driver, of course, still does talk to 11.2 onwards, depending on your Oracle client library version. I've listed just a few things here that thick and thin support. Added on top of that Python DB API connection pooling support, planned maintenance, DRCP, the database resident connection pooling. If you're scaling out, you can have a pool of connections in the database and get those shared across all of your mid-tier processes. Connection for autonomous database with one-way TLS and the mutual TLS. Obviously SQL and PL SQL support, did I really need to mention that? And standard things we've had, the array fetching, batch execution for performance. Standard data types, varchar2s, etc., and lobs. Some people might ask about JSON. I checked the manual on JSON. There's because we don't have some of the OSON encoders in the other client yet, you could need to use a type handler to do some of the JSON work if you're using that new 21C JSON data type. If you're still using the blob storage, the older JSON storage, then works fine because we have lob support already. At the bottom, you can see all of the sort of buzzwords we don't support, all of these really big GUIs. Some of these are really big projects to support. Application continuity, advanced queuing, continuous query notification, the SODA API, which is a document storage API, addition-based redefinition. You can actually set that in the application, but just not at connect time. And one of the types we don't support are your name collections and objects in thin mode. Thick mode supports all of these things, of course, as it always did in CX Oracle. So we'll gradually flesh out more and more stuff in the thin mode for the future versions, but already you can see in the middle there, you've got a great set of tools already at your available hands, if you know what I mean. So how do we enable thick mode? Well, by default, the driver starts in thin mode, so we actually have to enable it. And this is one of the changes from CX Oracle. You now have to call this init Oracle client method to enable thick mode. This snippet of code I've got on the screen will obviously only work where instant client is available, because that init Oracle client will try and load client library. So you can't just cut and paste this and expect it to run on M1 Mac, because we'll actually try and call init Oracle client and you won't have client libraries available by default. But some of you will have seen this snippet in lots of code and examples before that we've been promoting as a good way to initialize those client libraries. Unfortunately, on Linux, there's still an issue with particular third-party libraries we pick up in one of the sub-libraries in Instant Client. So basically, don't pass the path there or pass libdir equals none as the top example. The little snippet at the bottom is the recommendation that you don't pass libdir if you're already using some external path settings, because it could have problems if your path environment variable in Windows is different from the value you pass in as a libdir argument for init Oracle client. Not expecting any issues, but that's the kind of thing to avoid at all costs. So just be aware, are you setting Oracle client library paths externally or internally? And either way, you still have to call init Oracle client to turn into thick mode. So once you're in thick mode, you can't go back. And you also need to do this before you actually open any connections, because once you open a connection, Python Oracle DB is just going to run in thin mode all the time. So moving on. So there are some other new features. We've obviously spent a lot of effort putting time and resources into the thin mode, refactoring, polishing, testing, etc. But we do get some time to add some extra functionality. Some code annotations work nicely because we now have the Python top layer of code. It's Oracle defaults object. I'll show you in the demos later. A couple of new classes can be used, totally optional if you want to kind of encapsulate your connection parameters and pass those around in the application. You can create objects with this new correct params or pool params classes with usernames or pool sizes or whatever else, pass them around. Two-phase commit support. Some of you might have been tracking our Node Oracle DB driver, so that saw that land in a recent release for Node Oracle DB. And obviously we were busy working on this new driver for Python, and so that's where this has landed now for the new two-phase commit support. Advanced queuing, so this will be a two-phase commit and AQ thick mode only, but the AQ team has actually been helping out, and they now have added support for recipient lists, which is great. Error class, small changes there. That's useful for this dead error detection. We've been working with Mike Bayer from the SQL Alchemy team, so I think he wanted this, so we've added that in. Init Oracle client used to be slightly problematic. I mean, technically, it can only be called once. It can only do its work once to load libraries once in a process. And we kind of enforce that in CX Oracle by throwing an error if you try to call it more than once. Now we just ignore second and subsequent calls as long as the parameters are the same. Connection is healthy. We've been doing some work with frameworks, and often they don't want to do a full round-trip ping to the database to actually check whether connection really is okay. So we've added a kind of client-side check. So it's not going to be 100% guarantee, but it's still going to check a few things for you. So they're just a couple of the things which are added in there. Nothing super, but just incremental, and obviously on top of the thin mode, we have a really big release. So more connection parameters, and these got added for the main reason that we are trying to get away from having configuration files. So only the thick mode will read SQLnet.aura files. So if you're passing things like wallet locations and things, whatever, which you used to do in a SQLnet file, some of the connect timeouts, TCP connect timeouts, these are now handled in connection parameters. Both modes do read TNSNames.aura files, but I should point out that particularly in things like Oracle Home environments, there's no sort of concept of Oracle Home. It's all, there's no bequeath connections. You need to explicitly tell the driver where the TNSNames.aura file is, either via environment variables or configuration. It's not going to find a default. There is sort of no default. There's no Oracle client. Doesn't know about Oracle database. So you need to specify that explicitly. The same way actually in JDBC, that you have to specify that. That's in thin mode. Thick mode still has a sort of lower client library lookups. Actually, I'll go back there. There's one thing on the bottom in that big long list called debug JDWP, and that's a funky thing. So by setting that, the thick mode CX Oracle always looked up an environment variable of the same name and could let you debug through PL SQL from your Python editor. So in Visual Code, you could be debugging through Python, you could be calling PL SQL, and then you can step through the PL SQL at the same time as well, just by setting up a listener for that Java debug wire protocol listener. So we've now got a setting for that, and then we'll have blog posts coming up at some stage. That's just a little tweak there. This slide, as I flashed up, is recognition of the new Python top layer to the driver, and just lets us do more with Visual Studio, in this case, Visual Studio Code, and you see code completion, so it's showing you all of those extra parameters which are available. Kind of nice. Yeah, we couldn't do this with the old code base. We had to do this bigger restructure, re-architecture, refactoring of the code base. So I have an obligatory slide about Oracle database on the cloud. As you can imagine, I think every Oracle talk has one of these. So this also shows those new connection parameters. So when you're using mutual TLS, the MTLS, the two-way TLS, whichever you want to call it, we now need in thin mode a PEM format wallet. And the autonomous database shared guys have actually put those that PEM format wallet in their new wallets when you download them, so you can go and re-download and get that format correct. Or we have a little bit of script in the documentation which will convert the .sso wallet format into a PEM format if you want to use that. So you can see here the code, wallet location, just passing the directory where the wallet will be stored, and there'll be a wallet password that you would have created when creating that wallet. I'm showing you a couple of extra parameters there, the proxy and proxy port. You might have used these in the past with that Easy Connect Plus syntax, which is still available on all of the drivers. I'm just showing you here inside the Oracle firewall, as I often am. It's kind of useful to set those, but they do slow things down, so don't use those for production. And of course, there's one key thing is that you may not need to use any of this because the ADBS now supports, databases now support one-way TLS without wallets. So you can enable that directly on your cloud console, and then you don't need to worry about wallets at all on Python Oracle DB side. If you're using that in thick, you need a fairly recent Oracle client, or you can just use the thin mode. So how do you upgrade code? Well, there is a whole appendix in the new manual about this, but the bottom line is relatively simple. Install a new driver. You probably don't want to change the whole namespace, but you can just do this import as CX Oracle, so you don't have to do a search and replace. And the one key thing, semi-unfortunately, partly due to this whole move to Python at the top layer, partly just due for actually supporting the Python database API properly, is you now need to use named parameters in connection calls. And so if you're not using them, as you can see there, the top line UN PWCS, you now need to pass user equals password equals DSN equals. Or you can pass the whole username / password at CS as a single positional parameter. I don't recommend this latter approach because if your password has a / or an @ then it causes parsing problems. And obviously, you probably don't want to be hard coding some of these things in any way. But both of those do work. And then you have to make a choice. Finally, are you using thick mode or using thin mode? Do you call init Oracle client, yes or no? And then check the documentation for all of the other small changes. We'll see a few coming up. So one thing, error messages in Arc Controller are a little bit better. So thick mode and CX Oracle might have given you a sort of bind error, not all variables bound, not particularly helpful. Our new driver in thin mode can actually tell you what the variable name was, and uses perhaps a slightly better description. The bind variable replacement value was not found. So your SQL string had a :mybv, my bind variable, but you didn't actually pass the value for that. And the bottom example, we're trying to improve some of these error messages even for the database, but our driver has been able to bring these updates directly. So we're actually being able to tell you which service you were calling, host, port number, et cetera, And a little bit on the end, similar to Aura 12514, is a kind of hint to say, hey, go and look at all the documentation which exists, all the problems people have logged for that particular error. Be interested to know whether you think that helps or doesn't help. We can change these messages pretty quickly. So there are some things, not all messages can be nice. I mentioned the named use for named parameters. So if you don't use named parameters, this is the kind of message you get. So type error wrap takes from 0 to 1. It's like, what is this going on here? Well, the first thing is, what is this word wrapped? Luckily, there'll be an error stack, and the error stack will give you the error line of code, which there's a problem. The first fix, which has gone in post this morning's release, has actually been to change that wrapped to actually show the word connect. And the same for create pull. But anyway, these things will get better on and on. The real key is, of course, why does it say positional when I've been telling you to use keyword arguments? And that is because you can use that syntax where you specify a single positional bind parameter. And your initial code at the top started using positional parameters. So the DB API kind of thought, oh, you're using positional parameters. I'm going to give you an error message saying you can have one positional parameter. So not so nice, a little bit out of our control. To be honest, it's no different for any other database vendor drivers. I'd like to improve it, but can't. There are some library and OS differences which make it very hard for us to detect and wrap error messages. I know, like if you give an incorrect wallet password, you get a particular PEM error from lower Python libraries, not particularly able to be wrapped because it's the same error for a number of different situations, so we can't detect which situation you're in. In this case, if you're connecting to a host computer, host is valid, but there's no database listener running. Then on Mac, you get this error 61, connection refused. On Linux, there's a different error, a little bit hard for us to wrap some of those things. So it's just going to be a matter of kind of reading the doc, Googling, and obviously just checking your syntax if you start getting connection errors. So I think this is the last slide before we just go into the demo, and then we can wrap up a few minutes early. Everybody wants to talk about performance. Your results are obviously going to vary. They are looking pretty good, as you can see there on the screen. This is thin mode. 50,000 row with 9 columns, default array size, which is 100. So you'd never use that in production. You'd bump that up for 50,000 rows. But this shows lots of round trips and lots of network traffic. So for these data types, we're getting much faster, less CPU, and there should be lower mem. Last time I checked, the memory usage was a lot lower as well. Inserting, don't ask me why there are 9 versus 10 columns, just historic in our test suite. So you're calling this execute many, which some of you know is the way to insert lots of data really quickly. Instead of calling 500,000 execute calls, you call 5 execute manys with lots of rows. Inserting is generally a lot faster. Thick mode numbers, roughly similar to CX Oracle. There has been some refactoring. All of our work over the last couple of weeks has been improving performance there. I think we'll do some ongoing work. One thing to note is that because we've done some refactoring and things are in Python, Python's infamous global interpreter lock comes into play. So if you're doing multi-threading, you might see some differences. Some things might be faster for dealing with numbers, but might be slower in some other area. So your sort of load profile of your application will change. So you need to do some benchmarking there. Obviously, if you're just doing inserts of data for data uploads, you don't need things like application continuity. Just use thin mode because you're going to get great performance out of that. And we'll continue to improve performance where we can. A lot of your app performance is anyway based on the SQL statements and architectures and all sorts of things. But the bits that we have control over, we're very happy about. Okay, let's have a look at some code. And I just had just 4 quick things that I wanted to talk about. I think you can see that screen. I'll just bump it up a little bit. One thing is that the thin mode doesn't have any of Oracle's globalization libraries in it. So it doesn't support things like the NLS parameters, NLS date format in particular. Let's just run this. I'll set up Python 3, just set up some environment variables to use my local database. And then Python, this is date 1. Let me just hide a fly over there so I can see the screen. And when things work up, you can see that this drops a table, creates a table, inserts a date. So it just binds a standard date in Python date time format. Nothing surprising there, and this is probably what we'd recommend that you use, and fetching it kind of gives that date. If we just try and insert a date as a string, I guess I can hide this one just for clarity, and we run it again. Not getting a not valid month error. And this is because I'm using the Australian, UK day before month, and the Oracle database always has it the other way around, US formats. Now, NLS date format environment variable isn't going to be respected, so you need to be setting it explicitly if you want that date to be inserted. And you need to do this efficiently, as I'll show you in a later example of using a connection pool. Yeah, love your feedback on this. It's something which is of interest to us, just to know what we can and can't support. This is obviously a round trip to the database. It goes across the database, uses network traffic, etc. So you don't want to be doing this every time you do an insert. And in fact, kind of generally would recommend avoid doing this. Or you could just use the two-number format around, two-date format around it is probably the better solution, as you know, in the Oracle space, and not use the alter session at all. So looking at dates here, I've got another example. So again, on fetching dates, we don't get any nice little hand holding. Let me run this on the left-hand side of the screen. So actually you can kind of see in the comments anyway, they match the output on the left. So if you're just selecting sysdate, you're going to get the date time object back in this first example at the top. And then in the second example with the naive type handler, using an out converter and a type handler to say, hey, if the database is returning a date type, then actually just do a little bit of formatting and convert that into a different format. And obviously you can see in the comment or on the left-hand side of the screen, the kind of format that it gives. And if you want to go fancy, you can look at the bottom example, similar thing, but this time we're using the locale date format. So you get a kind of customized date format, which in this case, if you look at the top, where I'm setting locales, then that's why I'm getting a sort of German format at the bottom. So this is with thin, type handlers will still work with thick, although be careful with statement cache issues. If you're using the same SQL statement, then the statement cache kind of kicks in and you might find that these are not working. For example, if I got rid of these connection cursor calls and just reuse the same cursor, excuse me, you get a surprise that the out converters don't seem to be being called, and that's because you're really reusing the same statement from the first iteration. That's just by the by comment. So yeah, date handling's changed a little bit in that NLS layer. Hopefully you are going to adopt using the Python locale things functionality and move forward with that. But just be careful if you try to swap backwards and forwards between thick and thin modes. Let's look at this Flask pool example. So Flask micro framework, database driver agnostic, doesn't need a lot of explanation. Here's another example where I'm creating a pool. So I'm using this new name for create pool. You can still use session pool if you like. And I'm just passing all of the parameters in separately as attributes. And I'm also not just using the application connection pool, I'm using a database resident connection pool as well, DRCP. And we now have support for setting the class impurity when you actually create the pool. That's an enhancement over CX Oracle. And for various technical reasons, would recommend doing that because you can reuse sessions better. There's just a minor optimization there, which can kick in. Basically, if you don't do that, you have to throw away something you've created. So this is good. I'm using a fixed size pool. Incrementers too. So if the pool catastrophically dies for whatever reason, connection network goes down, then want the pool to jump back in increments of 2. In older versions of CX Oracle, well, rather, in older versions of Oracle Client Libraries, you would have had to set that to 0, which would have actually then rounded up to 1. But recent versions kind of do recommend bumping that by a little bit. There's a session callback. So I mentioned not using that alter date statement or running that alter date statement every time you get a connection or every time you execute a statement. That's the kind of thing you might put in an init session pool callback. So this session pool callback will be called once per connection in the pool. So you're pretty much just like 4 times. Obviously, if there's pool, something dies and has to be recreated, then when that connection gets recreated, this will be called the first time that connection gets used. But it doesn't get called after that. So it records the session state. Means very efficient way of making sure that all your connections using the application have the same session state. Flask is fairly minor. Here I just have an insert and fetch, and I've realized now I've skipped over one thing, and that is this defaults. I said I was going to talk about defaults. So if you look here, I've done a sort of fake thing, and I've just set the username to be a clob data type. So it's not particularly what you do in production, but I just wanted to show off this false. So, in the Oracle world, lobs have kind of streaming model where you go and you get a chunk of data from them, and then you go back and get a second chunk and another chunk. And Python does that by default by giving you a lob class, and then you can use operators like read on that lob class. That's a bit of a pain. It's actually also not very efficient. So by setting this, saying, hey, I don't want to fetch a lob, I just want to fetch a string, so this is why it's false. I know I'm fetching a lob, but I'm not fetching it as a lob class, I'm fetching it as a string. So that's this naming here. We went backwards and forwards over whether this should be true or false, but this is the way it is at the moment. By setting this defaults to false, then I'm going to get a string back immediately, and when I do the query, when I select the username, it's just going to come back as a string, and I can just print it back out and return the value to the user. I don't know that I really need to run this. It's just a useful example. And most of it, except some of the stuff with the lobs and what have you, is in the Oracle sample directory for the new driver, which I'll show you in a minute. And the last thing I just wanted to show off a little bit is a very, very, what I'm going to call hacky example. It's also public in the samples directory of the GitHub repository. And it is kind of, you can think of it as like SQL+. Sorry, that's probably a bit faint in contrast. But it has lots and lots of differences. In particular, it doesn't do wrapping of query columns, and it doesn't do substitution of bind variables. But it's kind of fun to play with. It gives you a prompt, and you can do connect Oracle PDB1, and I can do select sysdate from Joule or something like that on the left. So wrapping is really not going to work, as I said, column wrapping, so it's going to be a bit of a mess. But I'm showing you this particularly for people who are starting to use M1 chips on Apple, where we don't have instant client. If you don't want to have to install SQL Developer or any of those other big Java-based tools, which take a lot of space with the JDKs, JREs, then you can just install thin mode of Python, just run the script. At least you can do a few, create tables and things like that. So that's just a little baby, and love to see some GitHub enhancement requests for this come in to add state. You can see, it does do relatively okay checking to see whether things are SQL statements, PL SQL or SQL+ statements, and spits them up. And a lot of these things are not supported. You get a message, but there's a function in there you can start adding support if you do want to extend this for your own needs. And so that's about it from the code. I'll just show the repository quickly. So we do have new namespace. I'll put up a slide with that later. Have all of the samples. And there's a tutorial in there for various reasons to do with caching. I can't actually, GitHub does something odd with permanent redirects. And if you go to the home page for the driver, which I'll show you later, then you'll be able to get a nicely presented version of this HTML file. Otherwise, you can just play with the tutorial. We're starting to push out videos on usage. We'll update there's a couple of tutorials for Mac, Windows, and Linux on the oracle.com website, which are really nice quick starts. We'll go and update those in the upcoming days. So what are the futures? Just to wrap up, you're obviously going to add more features, especially into the thin mode. General usability, I mentioned the error messages, look at performance and try and really, improve that where we can. Not that I think there are any issues there, but, everybody loves performance. So we've got the opportunity with the new code base to revisit that. Obviously, new database features are going to come to us, which we'll have to support, so they'll land. One thing which we have seen people ask for quite often in the CX Oracle world was support for the async IO model of programming. Now we have the thin driver, we can start looking at supporting something like that. So we've been talking about that. It's a bigger job. It's not a trivial thing. It's not like Anthony just doing that fix for the messages he did in a few minutes today. It's a big thing. We have to design the API and what it's going to look like. So just jump on, try the new driver, make suggestions, let us know about that, and then we'll start looking at as where we can, as we have to juggle all these new database features with things that you as developers would like to see. CX Oracle. So it's Python Oracle DB is just a major upgrade. You've dealt with them all before, as I've mentioned. Do your due diligence. We know some of you probably have bigger code bases out there that you're probably never going to migrate, so no problems with that. You know where to find us. This is no different to other major releases. We've never really had problems with people staying at older versions. It's been very, very stable. So just to kind of set your mind at ease, we'll probably just keep doing a couple of CX Oracle releases. If there's a new version of Python, 3.11 or something like that, we might push out CX Oracle binary packages for that. Any critical fixes, obviously, we push those out. All new features will be in Python Oracle DB. Everything is subject to demand and whatever, but that's our current intent at this stage. So it's a great driver. In summary, just to wrap up with a minute or so to spare, just a new iteration of CX Oracle that you love and know, major release that has some new functionality, some changes, new deprecations, thin driver by default, which are very fast, very efficient, very functional already out of the box with support for the Python DB API and extra connectivity enhancements and the other bits and pieces we put into it. And the optional thick mode then brings it up to the same level that CX Oracle had that you're very familiar with at this current stage. And with that, thank you. I have finished. Let me just put up a slide with some links. So if you want to follow the announcement this morning, I put it on medium.com where I'm now blogging. And so I've got a tiny URL there to contract their very long URL. Other than that, we've got the new namespace. So the old CX Oracle GitHub repos and namespaces still exist, and this is totally a different namespace. And you can see myself, and then Sharon is going to be blogging. Sharon has a blog on upgrading coming out in that today or later. It may even be out now. But we certainly just look forward to hearing from you as you use this new driver going forward. And I think you'll be very excited with it as a thin driver. It's just so easy to install and use and connect to Oracle database. Enables so much with so many things. Thank you very much.
Hi, Christopher. Excellent presentation as always. I have one question that I can see on this chat window from Jin Leong. Which motor is faster, thin or thick?
We think at this stage thin is faster. So certainly the atomic tests we're using, just those varchar numbers, etc. I can go back to that slide. They were all with the thin. So thick mode numbers are similar to CX Oracle, but thin seems to be faster in the current implementation. As I say, we'll try and improve that as we go forward. So yeah, certainly start trying thin where you can. If you're already comfortable with CX Oracle, stay with it for a while, but start using your new code with thin. If you've got big data uploads, start using thin for big data uploads. I think you'll find that it's really good.
Okay, thank you so much, Christopher.
Yep. And thank you, Terry. I see a question there. Just thank you. Yep. So it's good to have people touching base.
That's good. Now, just checking at Facebook. I'm just waiting a few more seconds to see if anything else comes from the Facebook side. In the meantime, Christopher, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to share these new technologies and all the exciting things that you and your team are working on, and especially to the Asia Pacific and the global Oracle community that we have. And thank you so much for that.
You're welcome, Francisco. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yes, saying that, looks like there's no questions coming more for this chat and from the Facebook chat. That means thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Christopher, again. Please take care, be safe, and continue enjoying the conference that we still have in another, if not wrong, 3 sessions more today.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye, Chris.